He was suffocating in complete darkness, pressed against velvet and stone, when his cries for help could no longer break through his stiffened lips. His fingers, numb, covered in blood and nail clippings, crawled across the inside of the lid, scraping away the lacquer and wax, unable to pray or die. Under his fingernails were pieces of upholstery. Under his tongue was stagnant blood. Under his body were his own excrement. The air grew thinner with every breath, and the stench of death did not come from an imaginary corpse, but from a living, decomposing body, slowly rotting in a luxurious coffin under the coat of arms of the family that had betrayed him. Just 3 weeks ago, he was still called the most illustrious. Cardinal Savino Foscari, the last of the Piacenza canons, close to the Pope and bearer of relics, held within himself the remnants of the Church's authority in northern Italy. It was a troubled time. The southern dioceses did not recognize the new bulls. Reformation ideas were seeping into Brescia, and French priests were writing denunciations to Rome, accusing the bishops of collusion with the Lutherans. Foscari maintained a show of strictness. He burned several plague monks in Arezzo, conducted public confessions of the sick in hospitals, and took a vow of silence, which he broke only at night, screaming in his sleep. According to the testimony of his servant, Domenico Aldi, who later testified under oath, the Lord's body began to stink long before his death. He himself felt it, ordered himself to be rubbed with vinegar, covered his stomach with herbs, and forbade anyone to open the windows. The chronicles of the monastery of St. Agatha state, on the 8th day of the month, his body oozed blood from his ears and pus from his nipples, and no doctor would treat him, for they considered it a sign of divine wrath. The symptoms developed rapidly. First came a series of nighttime fevers, cold sweats, and delusions about a foul-smelling angel. Then his throat swelled up and he couldn't swallow. He was treated the traditional way. They cut open the veins in both ankles, let out 4 cups of blood, tied leeches to his armpits, and rubbed grated garlic and chicken fat into his chest. Nothing helped. His tongue turned black. At night, he vomited clots, and by the 3rd week, his lips cracked and began to fall off in pieces. His temperature did not drop. Dr. Paolo Manini, one of the last people to be admitted to Foscari's chambers, left the following note in his records. His body became like the skin of a corpse, gray with green spots, and it smelled bad even through the fabric. He lay motionless with cloudy tears flowing from his eyes. He whispered prayers, but his words were confused. He was still alive, but no priest dared to give him communion. Fearing a possible curse, Bishop Viterbo refused to read the absolution, citing the dying man's heretical hallucinations. When, on the 3rd day, his breathing stopped and his pupils did not react to light, he was pronounced dead. The body was washed, but the skin was already separating from the flesh. One of the servants got a burn on his palm. The smell was so acidic. According to church ritual, Foscari was to be buried in the altar crypt under a silver slab with an image of Saint Clement. However, they did not have time to embalm the deceased. Panic broke out in Piacenza, and rumors spread that the cardinal was cursed. The guards drove everyone out of the temple, and the body was placed in a lead coffin and sealed on the same day. No one knew that his heart was still beating. The first signs of life were noticed the next morning, but it was decided that it was just gas moving inside. Opening the sarcophagus was forbidden. When the monks noticed a slight scraping sound, they thought it was rodents. When he began to knock with his fingernails, they prayed for silence. 2 days later, everything fell silent. Only on the fourth night, when a foul-smelling liquid gushed out from under the slab, and one of the junior novices fainted from the acrid smell, was the sarcophagus opened. Inside lay the cardinal, bent in convulsions, his fingers twisted, his jaw broken, and his eye sockets empty. He had rotted alive, scratching the same word on the inside of the lid. "Let me go." The sound of iron and stone scraping against each other reached him, muffled as if underwater. Someone above was trying to open the lid, but either did not know he was alive or it was already too late. At first, he screamed, his voice hoarse and bloody, until he began to vomit, and his throat tore from the inside. Then he just moved around in the darkness, surrounded by the stench of his own body. The coffin was not a sarcophagus, but a funeral cabinet lined with velvet, which was already soaked with pus and urine. His eyelids were swollen, his eyes were running. His fingernails were falling off his fingers. He was still moving, but he no longer knew why. After 3 days, he began to run a fever. In the damp and stuffy air, the body quickly stops functioning. His intestines stopped working, but he still felt the pressure of internal excrement. His stomach swelled up. He felt a sharp pain in his right side, which then subsided, leaving only a heavy pressure, as if something inside him had swollen and died. He knew that something was rotting inside him, but he couldn't see it. From the archival notes of Dr. de la Chapelle, compiled after the autopsy, the liver was black, completely covered with ulcers. The heart was soft, like mush. The lungs were clogged, foul-smelling and slimy. Traces of life remained, presumably for several days after the burial. The back of the head was broken from the inside, apparently from hitting a stone. Half of the fingernails were torn off. The lips were gnawed by the teeth. According to witnesses, servants heard noises in the crypt the evening after the funeral, but the guards did not allow anyone to enter. They explained it away as the breath of the earth. A day later, the noises stopped. 9 days passed between the funeral and the autopsy. The walls of the sarcophagus were damp. Dark pus had accumulated inside the coffin. His hair was matted. Nothing remained of his face. The skin had peeled off in layers. There were claw marks on his feet. It was clear that he had tried to get out. The lid of the coffin was scratched from the inside. He did not die immediately. According to rumors, later recorded by monks, he prayed until the very end. "At least," he muttered. The words were indistinct, but one of the younger novices claimed to have heard forgiveness. Another added, "Jesus, accept the rotting one." Panic broke out outside the castle walls. The man, buried alive, was a ruler whose death was supposed to set in motion the chain of succession to the throne. But while he was rotting underground, those above waited for a clear sign. He was not declared dead. His body was not shown. The throne was empty, and the two pretenders, his son and brother, were already placing guards in the corridors. The servants did not know whom to turn to. Secret advisors avoided meetings. One of them, Abbot Jerome, was found hanged in the refectory on the 5th day. His last note read, "He is alive there. We are all damned." No one knew who had ordered the burial. The servant who brought opium and black liquor to the ruler's bedroom disappeared. The doctor who signed the death certificate did not leave his room. He was found suffocated in the night by smoke. They say he was burning papers. According to a manuscript found later, the death was fictitious. The pulse was fading, but it did not stop. I was forced to sign. Servants on their knees begged not to open the sarcophagus. When the priest poured holy water on the stone lid, it hissed. 2 of the pallbearers refused to touch the body, citing a living curse. Another later went blind without explanation. All this is recorded in the monastery chronicle, but crossed out in red ink and signed by an unknown official. The man who was rotting inside had been paranoid in the last months before his death. He dismissed his 3 personal guards. He moved the altar to his bedroom. He slept only surrounded by candles. He did not touch the bed. He lay on the floor, prostrate. He said that the angel of death was hiding in the mirror. The priests could not convince him to accept the rite. He was afraid of confession. Too early, he said, he will hear. Before his demise, he ordered a cross to be placed in his mouth. He was found with a crucifix clenched between his teeth, his tongue cut, his teeth knocked out. Apparently, he had tried to swallow the metal. From a report from an envoy from Mainz, the smell in the crypt penetrated the stone. The courtyard lost its peace. The streets are silent. The candles in the towers do not go out. People are praying. They whisper, "He is not dead. He is still calling." When, 7 days after the funeral, warm steam mixed with a foul odor rose from under the marble slab, the chaplains explained it as the mercy of God. "The spirit is rising," said one. Another crossed himself and turned away, suppressing a gag reflex. A third, pale and with swollen eyelids, wrote in his diary with a trembling hand, "The temperature in the crypt has risen. The walls are weeping. This is either a miracle or a punishment. Perhaps he is alive." On the 8th day, the smell spread beyond the chapel. The maids began to complain of headaches, and one of the guards lost consciousness. However, no order was given to open the slab. Cardinal Frati, acting as spiritual head of the court, strictly forbade any interference until permission was received from the papal nuncio. He gave no explanation. Rumors spread throughout the Vatican. Meanwhile, under the layer of stone, the flesh of the still warm body began to decay. According to a report later compiled by Brother Costanzo, a pharmacist, in cases of burial without prior treatment of the body in a hot room, decomposition begins in the abdominal cavity. After 3 days, intestinal gases distend the intestines, causing the skin to crack and the eyes to bulge. On the 5th day, the eyelids begin to stick together, and on the 7th, the nails and hair peel away, exposing grey areas of the dermis. The vocal cords, covered with mucus, could make sounds when the chest moved. It was this horror that the novice Giovanni heard when he was carrying water to the crypt and heard someone praying softly, hoarsely, through phlegm. The report of the wheezing reached the cardinal on the 9th day. In response, he ordered the entrance to the crypt to be sealed with wax and forbade anyone to descend except the senior cleric Galoni, a man with no hearing and almost no sense of smell. Galoni refused to go down, citing signs of God's wrath. A record of this was kept in the archives of the notary's office at the cathedral, marked "Not to be disclosed until the death of the sovereign." Meanwhile, the count's widow, the recently widowed Madame Dianetta, brought a letter to the court, supposedly written by the deceased and dated the day after his funeral. The letter contained a request for forgiveness, a mention of the coldness of stone, and the incessant singing that I hear in my own throat. The paper was stained with dried black slime. The count's seal was cracked, but genuine. The paper was taken away and burned in front of the emperor's envoy, who called it a forgery caused by grief. On the 11th day, the crypt began to flood. Liquid appeared from nowhere, resembling murky sulfur with reddish foam. The floors of the chapel were covered with a film. The servants began to leave the court. One of the monks, who was trimming the grass in the apothecary's garden, wrote in a note, "If he was alive, he is dead now. But if he was dead, what is knocking on the stove every night from 3 to 5 o'clock?" At that time, rumors of a conspiracy began to spread. It was said that one of the junior doctors had given the deceased a decoction of mandrake to calm his convulsions, and that the body had been declared lifeless because of a weak pulse. Some spoke of ergot seeds sprinkled in the bread, others of a deliberate attempt to kill him. In the basement of the monastery, they found a servant who had worked in the deceased's chambers. He had lost his mind and was smearing the walls of his cell with a mixture of ash and blood, muttering. He sang. He couldn't die because his voice came through the ground. He called me by name. The servant was strangled with a handkerchief and burned without a funeral service. On the 13th day, 2 doctors from the north arrived in the Vatican, summoned by the widow. One of them wrote, "Judging by reports of body temperature and putrid vapors, the accumulation of gas could have caused vibrations in the chest. These vibrations, being audible, were interpreted as singing. However, this does not exclude the possibility of conscious life during the first 2 or 3 days after burial." Cardinal Frati refused to open the sarcophagus. His signature appears on the ban. To avoid confusion, doubt, and disputes with the faith. On the 14th day, the inscription on the tombstone was changed. The words "died in peace" were added to the name and carved out again to hide the date. The mason who carried out the work was later drowned in a barrel of lime for spreading rumors about a living body under the marble. At that moment, smoke began to rise from the crypt again. Someone saw the outline of a face in it. It smelled of blood and honey. The dead man was still singing. On the 15th day, the morning began with crimson moisture rising from the stone floor of the chapel. It spread from the center of the slab, following the pattern of the marble, like a vein, like a crack. Brother Clemente was the first to notice it, and he immediately screamed, tearing off his cassock. The skin on his legs was burned, as if the liquid had burned through the fabric. He was carried away. 2 hours later, he died. Before he died, he whispered, "He's breathing under me. I can hear his heart beating. Not mine, someone else's." The next day, riots broke out. Several pilgrims made their way into the monastery courtyard, wanting to see the miracle. One tried to break the marble slab with a crucifix. He was strangled by the guards. Another, an old woman, dressed in black, took a pig's head, covered with spots and worms, out of a basket, and said that it was a sign of the flesh of the saint who cannot die until he forgives. She was taken away. She was never seen again. Cardinal Frati fell ill. He did not leave his chambers and demanded that juniper needles be burned in the fireplace at all times. In a note to the chaplain, he wrote, "I cannot sleep, for I hear singing, as if from the mouth of the earth itself. It is calling me. I will not go." Meanwhile, the body, left in a closed space without being opened, continued to decompose. Medical reports, compiled secretly and passed through the widow to the monastery pharmacy, said that by this time the process of marble swelling should have begun. In places where the flesh touched the stone, salts were secreted, moisture rose, and the mortar of the slab began to release the corpse's moisture to the outside. And so it happened. Touching the edges of the tomb was burning hot. A guard who accidentally leaned on it lost a fingernail. His finger was covered with black slime. He died that night. Rumors spread. Some said that the count was not just a count, but a man who had taken a secret vow, and that his prayers continued even after his clinical death. That his voice was heard, but no one believed it because the monks were ordered to remain silent. The deceased, they claimed, lived in anger but died in humility and now cannot leave until he is heard. Rats began to die in the monastery kitchen. One morning, they were all dead, their mouths torn open as if something had entered them. The apothecary sprinkled dried wormwood in the storeroom. The wine in the jugs turned sour overnight. The cook's hands were covered with scales. He was called to the crypt at night. He heard a voice calling his name. He left with a knife and never returned. On the 21st day, the count's widow came to the monastery, accompanied by 2 heavy horses and 16 servants. She stood at the gate and demanded that the stove be opened, saying that not everything was dead yet inside. She was refused. During the night, a fire broke out in the west wing of the monastery. The library was burning. Only a few parchments survived. One of them was transferred to the pharmacy. It mentioned an ancient ritual of calling a voice from marble. No one read it aloud. By the morning of the 23rd day, the slab began to crack. The guards turned to the cardinal. He remained silent. Only a day later, when the marble began to breathe, you could hear something shifting inside, as if a light body were rotating in cavities of gas. Did the cardinal sign the order with a trembling hand, open the slab, and consign the remains to the flames? The text of the order has not been preserved. It was destroyed as soon as it was delivered to the crypt. The work began in the dark. First, the seals were broken. Then, the first layer was removed. Next, the edges were carved away. When the slab had been moved halfway, one of the participants cried out. A muffled sound escaped from inside. Not air, not a voice, but not a rotten click either. At that moment, all 5 men holding the crowbar fell down. 1 died on the spot. 2 went mad. The 4th screamed, "He's looking! He's moving!" The 5th was dragged back. His throat was damaged, as if he had been bitten from the inside. The body was never removed. Black steam with grey bubbles rose from it. The flesh had stuck to the inner walls of the stone box. The hair had rotted away, but the teeth, bare and yellow, were clenched. The eyes were half open. And according to the monk Walter, who left a note in his notebook, there was a thread in the throat, thin as a hair, black and stretched from the tongue to the lungs. When it was touched, the slab made a sound again. The cardinal ordered everything to be put back in place, and to write, "Let it not be opened until the trial." But no one heard the singing again. It stopped that same night. A week after the failed attempt to open the sarcophagus, there was a sudden change in the air of the monastery. Candles went out on their own. Oil soured in lamps. Wine turned into a murky slime. People turned pale and fell silent. Inside the crypt, there was a smell that defied description, not dead, but painfully dense, as if suffering had become a substance. According to later reports by the apothecary Guillaume, the deceased had not been cremated, and when the crypt was reopened on the 33rd day, in the presence of a new vicar who had arrived on behalf of the Northern Diocese, the body was something described in the treatise On Decomposition as wet mummy. The flesh had become viscous, the face had disappeared, and the rib cage was like a sieve. The skin had peeled off, exposing half-rotten bones with strands of fabric stuck in them, which could not have been his clothes. All that remained of the lungs were clots, black, hollow, fragile, with cracks in the center. When touched, one of them crumbled. Inside was a dried piece of cloth, a prayer scroll rolled up on itself, as if it had been placed there during his lifetime. By this time, the monks had begun to leave the monastery. The chaplain was the first to go. Then the archivist. Then the vicar himself. He left a short note. He prayed until the walls closed in on him. "We have condemned an innocent man." The bishop refused to read it in the cathedral, but the rumor spread. A month later, the crypt was completely walled up. The vaults were filled with lime, and the entrance to the chapel was blocked with bars. The last person to enter was Pierre, an engraver from Arles, who died of blood poisoning. According to the doctors, a shadow was growing in his wound. The remains of the body were never buried. They were walled up inside the sarcophagus, which became cracked like old wood. The people believed that he continued to pray, unaware that he was dead. Some came to the wall, touched the marble, and whispered their requests, especially widows, the insane, and the elderly. One of them, Jean, a blacksmith from the suburbs of Lyon, claimed to have heard a voice saying, "Forgive them. I have forgiven everyone except one." He did not know the name. The political consequences were not long in coming. The brother of the late count, referring in his reports to the madness and heresy of the deceased, declared himself temporary ruler of the district. He was supported by the archbishop, whom the count himself had once humiliated at court. The new order included the abolition of a number of favors granted by the deceased. The reformers declared that his death was a sign of punishment for pride. Catholics, on the contrary, demanded recognition of martyrdom. Clashes broke out in the city. The treatise describing the opening of the sarcophagus was burned. The official chronicle, published a year later, claimed that the count had died of suffocation. There were no irregularities in the embalming. The chronicle ended with the words, "May his ashes rest in peace, and may the walls be cleansed of memory." But they were not cleansed. 2 years later, a tree grew in the monastery garden, dry, crooked, with black resin on its trunk. Birds did not sit on it. There was no grass or ash around it, only the earth, as if boiled, and so it remained.